What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. As you guys definitely know by now, one of my personal favorite things to do whenever a new champion releases is to definitely search for and learn about all the information about their design process to try and figure out exactly what happened in their development cycle and what changes they went through. And Camille, of course, is no exception, and I've been wanting to make this video for a long time, but I did have to wait until enough information was released about her. Well, we finally arrived at that point, and so today we're taking a look back before the release of Camille to find out what Camille could have been. And if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button, and if you don't enjoy the video, feel free to hit that dislike button too, and let's get started. Now, unlike some of Riot's other champion developments who were more about a concept than a specific role, like maybe Thresh for example, who was never even intended to be a support champion early on, they actually settled on the Diver as a really broad role that they wanted to explore for their new champion when designing Camille. And this all happened in the ideation phase that comes of, dreaming up their new champions. Any kind of direction is really just up for consideration, which means that sometimes writers might look at unexplored artistic opportunities or archetypes that aren't currently in the game, and other times instead they might look directly at design and try to think about a role in the game that they aren't currently filling with another champion. And when the Diver direction was decided on for Camille, Riot started to throw out a bunch of different unique ideas as possible to try and make a Diver with a more unique gameplay style. Things like swinging around with a grappling hook, bouncing off terrain, doing parkour, or even destroying terrain were all concepts that were originally considered. The idea here was to make a champion capable of diving that didn't just do a boring conventional gap closer. It was being tied to terrain or some sort of interesting mechanic to introduce something new that League hadn't seen before. Now, Camille originally had two prototype names from this point up until about 6 months through her development: Diver and Hookshot. The Hookshot champion had actually been pitched quite a few times before, and Riot actually drew inspiration from the anime show Attack on Titan, as well as just a ton of other different sources as a really awesome way to make it happen. In fact, Riot originally had a playable Hookshot champion back in 2013, and although at the time it obviously didn't pan out, awesome ideas like that ended up not going to waste since they just were iceboxed until the concept was later revived. And since Riot were in the process of trying to develop an interesting new Diver, the pieces kind of just lined up perfectly and they went about trying to find a theme to make it work. And Riot Shadowstorm shared some of her potential themes that they messed around with, and they make a lot of sense when you're talking about someone actually using a grappling hook. A gadget belt, anti-hero vigilante, or super scientist type character were all kind of like foundations to build the concept off of. These themes timed in best with 3 different factions in Runeterra: Noxus, Zon, or Piltover, and while they're all different enough from each other to be distinct, having a few choices for the direction like that really helps Riot nail down exactly what kind of design and personality they want to use for their new champion. Now, originally, Camille's concept was closer to some sort of cyborg Mary Poppins. Rather than being the really sleek and sinister Camille that we've encountered on release, she was meant to fall somewhere between like a James Bond kind of spy figure and this elegant, experienced lady sort of character, although she was always going to be somewhat robotic. Now, since the Hookshot ability was the first part of her kit to be worked on, Riot started by iterating different ways of actually making that happen. For example, at one point she was essentially just this English Spider Woman, and would loop around walls and hook like maybe 5 times in a row and work on a charge sort of system. Other goofy concepts like this were maybe messed around with, until Riot eventually stumbled upon the sword leg concept during her development. Now, all of the Hookshot concepts they messed around with worked quite well, so there was a chance that Camille could have been released without her sword legs actually, but since Riot knew they wanted to go with a cyborg character rather than like a gadget belt type character, and it just turned out that robot sword legs was actually a really awesome way to accomplish that cyborg concept and still get that really flashy but still elegant sort of feel to her. Now, they didn't actually settle on the name Camille until 6 months into her development, which was around June 2016. Apparently, Riot Thermal Kitten had come up with around 100 total names for this Hookshot champion, that was then narrowed down to 5 or 6. The aim was to find a name that would give off the impression of like an aristocrat, someone of high status almost, while also still being quite feminine and giving off the feeling of a proper Piltovan lady. In terms of her art direction, it's hard to go wrong with a sword-legged cyborg aristocrat, and unfortunately, there isn't actually that much art to go off of from what we have. So some of the hookshot concept art shows Camille with a pretty different appearance, wearing a dress with some short dark hair, so Riot probably explored a bunch of different clothing ideas before they found the right balance of sophistication and deadliness. Now the hardest part of Camille's appearance was to capture the idea that her Hex Tech core that powers her super legs was slowing but not stopping her aging process. And since she's not immortal, she wouldn't appear as a young woman, but they do need to show the aging process, so they went for a more refined, middle-aged sort of look. Now the other part of champion design is of course gameplay, and Riot's design team has been hard at work finding ways to make melee champions a little bit more interesting to play, or at least trying to. Now there's two main design philosophies that Riot focuses on that come into play here, and they go by the names of positioning and windows of effectiveness. And Riot actually released a dev blog detailing about how they were used to help shape Camille's gameplay. So starting off with positioning, Camille actually has quite a few abilities that kind of just force her to use positioning that is a lot more complicated than just sitting in auto attack range. For example, her tactical sweep on her W actually makes her leave melee range if she wants to get the absolute most power out of the ability. And this plays in nicely with her Q, which requires her to be in melee once, and then in melee range again within a couple of seconds of a delay. But it doesn't actually require her to stay in melee range between those hits. So she can, for example, use her Q on a target, use her W, move a little bit back, and then move back into melee range for the second Q and the bonus damage it gives because of the slow on the W. Now, it's not a huge amount of movement or, complex gameplay, but it does create an opportunity for enemy players to play around her. For example, if she moves back to W, you can move outside of the cone and make her miss, or you could close the distance and damage her while she can't auto attack for her passive shield or something. Her hookshot is also a really solid ability for making both players keep positioning in mind. It was designed with the fact that it would be easier for Camille to land her E on someone if they were near a wall in mind, and as a result, it's designed in a way to make the laning phase a bit more interesting to play out because it stops being just about whether the two fighters are in melee range or not. There's now other things to consider in positioning. And windows of effectiveness is the next design philosophy Riot focused on, and Camille's a great example of this because she has very strong abilities that are gated behind different cooldowns. For example, you can use her Q pretty often, but the best trading tool she has is her Adaptive Defenses passive, and that is definitely on a pretty significant cooldown. Camille was developed with this in mind, of course, because she can wait for her passive to have an amazing window of power, or she can just focus on trading with her Q and, not always wait for the passive to be up, although the risk is going to be a lot bigger for her. It's about making the matchup feel really dynamic and not one-sided. Both playing Camille or playing against her is at least supposed to introduce a lot of thought processes that make the gameplay more interesting and more exciting. Now, Release Camille definitely has a pretty interesting take on a diverse kit, but it definitely took a lot of tuning, fine-tuning, and tweaking to make it work at the end of the day. Now, Riot Scruffy mentioned that gameplay as a whole is developed in phases that they build up from, and if things maybe fall apart or aren't right at any given phase, they'll either be rebooted or iceboxed. And to start off, Riot bases the gameplay on a core hook, a feature of the champion, the defining feature that makes them unique and gives players a reason to want to play them. And for Camille, that was, of course, her hookshot. Next after that comes what Riot calls the play pattern, which is usually 3 of the 5 total abilities. And we'll sort of, lay out the foundations for the kit and make sure the gameplay goals for the champion are, still kept in mind and being a main focus. And finally, Riot, of course, finishes up the rest of the kit, aiming for something that's really interesting, synergistic, and hopefully with enough balanced levers that it can be tuned up or down in power without having to totally dismantle or change or scrap an ability in the future. As with all other champions, Camille was tested with other prototype abilities and mechanics to her gameplay that could have made her a lot different from how she is on release. So let's take a look at those. For Camille, the core of her design was of course hookshot, so it was the first ability locked in, but that doesn't mean that Riot just stumbled upon the perfect design for her hookshot straight away. Like everything else in her kit, it had a ton of different versions until Riot figured out and decided the absolute best way that they wanted it to function. For example, back when Camille was being designed as an English Spider-Woman, she had a hookshot that would swing her in an arc, and it could actually be recast multiple times, which meant that she could just swing around the map kind of like Spider-Man would, swapping between walls to essentially just Tarzan her way all sorts around the jungle, the terrain around the map. And Riot Jag noted that unfortunately it was kind of a mess to use and didn't actually offer much in terms of actual power, except really giving her godlike escape capabilities. It definitely didn't turn her into the diver type that they wanted. Riot also wanted to try to make it so that a champion couldn't escape from her even if they had mobility, and the idea that spawned was that she'd be able to completely impale an enemy and hook them into the ground, essentially locking them down completely. Now, a few versions later, and they had a hookshot that functioned as a dive tool and escape, and a way to prevent the escape of mobile enemies as well, and it's pretty similar to what we have now. Riot Jag mentioned that the goal was always to create a unique style of movement that would be this champion's signature move, and since her legs were kind of like the source point for her hookshot, that's actually where the idea of having knife legs came from, leading Riot to her Q and her W. And the next skill to be locked in for Camille was her Q, Precision Protocol. It was built to give a pretty cool way for Camille to approach fights with her knife legs and act as her main damage source, and it definitely did take a lot of refinement for Riot to make sure that both Camille and her enemy understood the gameplay, so that they were aware of how long to wait for the bonus damage. It was originally designed as a spell with a cast time, sort of like Kha'Zix's Q I guess, but it made more sense and was easier to get a feel for as an auto attack reset. After that came her passive, Adaptive Defenses, which was a lot less intense to develop compared to her other abilities and just really needed like a careful design and some tweaks to make sure that it wouldn't make her impossible to trade with. And of course, next is her ultimate, the Hextech Ultimatum. The reference, or at least inspiration for its design, were some of Fiora's old ultimate concepts, not really in terms of comparing the mechanics, but more like what the feeling of the design was aiming to achieve. The difference here is that although Fiora was meant to be taking on a fair fight, something she deems as a worthy challenge for her skills, Camille's a lot more like a predator, hunting down her prey, trapping them without much concern that the fight's going to be fair at the end of the day. And Riot actually had a really hard time getting the Hextech Ultimatum to function properly once they had settled upon the sort of caged-like concept. And Riot Scruffy actually mentioned that one of the funnier bugs was when Scion originally was caught in the cage, instead of stopping against one of the walls, when he was in his ultimate, he'd kind of go ping-pong bouncing around all the walls and stuff, doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and had a lot of problems in development. And since it was designed to prevent all escapes, it's a lot unlike anything Riot has ever made before, so the code, I'm sure, took a lot of refining to get working as intended. And the last ability to be designed for Camille was her W, Tactical Sweep, with the goal of giving her a mid-range ability alongside something to reduce the binary elements often found in melee champions, like positioning we kind of mentioned earlier. Putting a ranged ability onto Camille's kit makes things a lot more interesting than just getting into melee range and attacking someone, and it introduced a lot more skill-based mechanics and decision-making and positioning and stuff for both Camille and the person laning against her. Anyway, that's actually just about going to wrap up everything that we know about Camille's development. It really does sound like her gameplay all kind of flowed down from the iteration of hookshot that Riot ended up choosing. It would have been pretty crazy if they decided to go with that Spider-Woman sort of concept, since that way Riot would have probably never even thought of giving her those iconic knife legs. Either way though, I hope you guys enjoyed this journey through Camille's development. Definitely let us know in the comment section below what you thought about Camille's design. And either way, looks like that's going to be it from me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.